We're here on Daf Mem Zayin, and we're continuing with our study of the Rea, the lung. Omar Rava, another statement of Rava. We had a whole bunch yesterday. Hani tarti bui desmichi ladod. So now the question is, you have blisters on the lung, and these blisters adhere one to the other. Les lahu b'dikusa. There's no way that we can examine through what's called bitsputs, if you remember, as we discussed yesterday, and we'll have it again today, because it doesn't matter one way or the other. No matter what the results of the test will be, the very fact that these two blisters on the lungs are attached to each other, that is proof positive that there was a complete puncture in the lungs. And we said that if the lungs are punctured, then the animal is determined to be a treifa. Now, exactly how close the blisters are to each other is a little bit of an issue in the Rishonim and the Poskim. But in any event, the underlying premise of Rava is that when you have these two blisters that are adjacent one to the other, it's because there's a hole inside the lungs, and basically these two blisters formed around the hole. See, even though you took the lungs and you put them into water, and there was no bubbling, there was no bitsputs, the animal is determined to be a treifa based on the fact that the lung is punctured. And even though subsequently it could be possible that there was a membrane that plugs up the hole as a result of these two blisters, nevertheless, it still remains a treifa. Now, the Rashba adds another point here that when you have these two adjacent blisters, then each one sort of uh, joins the other one to exert pressure. And ultimately, what's going to happen is this is going to cause a puncture in the lung. However, says Rava, Chada umichazir kitarti, if in fact there's only one blister, it just looks to the eye as if it's two blisters, like it's one large blister, but there's something like depressed in the blister. So therefore, when you see this depression down in the middle, it looks to the eye as if there are two different blisters. So you're not exactly sure whether or not it's one or two blisters. Then we have a test. Mycene silva, silva's a thorn, uvazinon la, and we pierce that large blister. Now, we have to emphasize here that when we pierce the blister, we're not going to take the thorn and put it straight through the blister, but rather sort of like above the blister. And now let's see what the results are. Ish fachan la'adadi, if let's say the fluids from both sides flow one to the other from the hole that you made in one of them. So you only make this piercing in one of the two sides of the blister. You're trying to determine whether or not there are two different blisters. So now what you saw was that when you punctured one side of the blister, and the fluid drains now from both sides. This is very reminiscent of a Gemara in Menachos that we once learned about a Bechor that, believe it or not, was born with two heads. And the question is how much the owner, the father of this Bechor has to pay to the Kohen, whether he pays 5 slime or 10 slime. So Tosfos quotes that, we put some hot water on one head, and we see if the other head screams from the pain of the hot water, and that makes him into one. So here also, since the fluid came out of the other side as well as this side, that is proof positive that it's one large blister. Chadahi, it's one, and ksheira, and therefore the animal is kosher. But the lo, if you don't extract any fluid that flows from the other side, and therefore the fluid drains from only one side, in that side where you punctured and pierced a hole in that side, then tartininu, we can determine and establish that there are two different blisters. And that's why you didn't see any flow of fluid draining from the other side. And treifa, therefore, if it's two blisters, then, as we said before, the animal is treif. The Omar Rav, another psak of Rava. Now, we're looking at the lungs, and we're counting up une. You may remember that we spoke yesterday that une means lobes, right? The lungs are made up of lobes. And Rava says that there are 5 lobes. Chamisha uni isle l'reah. And Rava is going to give us a clue as to where these lobes are located, such that when we slaughter the animal and we look at the lobes of the lungs, we'll be able to tell us that everything is in place. You don't have too many lobes, or you don't have too less lobes, too few lobes. So first of all, says Rava, where are these lobes located? So now we have to get a perspective of these lobes, either from what's called Appa Klape Gavra. So let's say the animal is facing the person. Again, the animal has already been slaughtered, so it's not looking you in the eyes, so to speak. And if the animal's face, which if you imagine that the carcass of the animal is suspended, on from its hind legs and the head down, so then we're talking about the underside of the carcass. And what will you see there? So now you're facing the lungs. You'll see tlasa miyamina v'tarti mismola. There are going to be 3 lobes on the right side as you sort of look at the underside of the lungs. V'tarti mismola, and you'll see 2 lobes on the left. 2 and 3 is 5, so the total number is 5. So again, it seems like the butcher is actually cutting up the carcass from its hind legs, splitting the animal through the underside. And the butcher now faces the animal's exposed insides. On the right side, which is the right side of the animal and the right side of the butcher, he will see 3 lobes. And on the left side, he will see 2 lobes. And all this is an introduction to the next part of Rava's statement, namely chaser, o yasir. I'm going to skip 2 words for a minute. Treifa. If instead of 3 on the right and 2 on the left, he finds only 4 lobes, meaning he's missing 1 lobe, or alternatively yatir, or he finds an extra lobe, which, is some sort of a mutation, the animal is treifa. But now we have o cholif. Cholif means that instead of seeing three lobes on the right and two on the left, he finds two on the right and three on the left. And all this is an abnormality, and we're going to assume that there's a deficiency here in the animal, right? If the animal, for example, is chaser, means it's missing a lobe where normally it should be found, that's called a deficiency. That's chaser. If there's an extra lobe, it's treifa, based on the principle that, which is a sugya later on, that anything that's extra is as if it was removed. And if it's removed, then you've taken away one of the lobes from the animal, from the lungs of the animal, and that itself makes it treifa. And now the Gemara is going to challenge Rava with another opinion. They had a lung with an extra lobe, and they brought it in front of Meremar, one of the great Amoraim, for a psak. Havi Yosiv Rav Acha abova. Rav Acha was sitting abova. Abova means the gateway to the house. Now, the butcher who's holding on to these lungs and wants to enter into the house of Meremar to ask him for a psak because there was an extra lobe, he now gets a psak from Meremar, and then he leaves the house. As he leaves the house, Omer Le Rav Acha, who is situated at the entrance to the house, turns to the butcher and he says, "My Omelach, how did he paskin? Omer le'achsho niela." He was machsha the animal. He said it's not a treifa. Now, how could this be? Because Rav Acha understood that based on Rava, if there's an extra lobe in the lungs, then it's treif. Amalo, therefore, Rav Acha turns to the butcher. He says, bring it back. In other words, like force the hand, so to speak, of Meremar to look again at the lungs as if he had never seen the lungs and get a new psak before you eat the meat. Amalei, now the lung is brought a second time by this butcher in front of Meremar, and Meremar begins to sense that something's fishy over here. Why is the butcher coming back for a second question? And it must be that Rav Acha, who apparently would often do this, was sitting at the entrance to Meremar's house, and he must have told the butcher to go back in. And Zil Emale, I want you, the butcher, to go back and tell Rav Acha, Lemandi Yosef Abova, he didn't call him by his name. He said to that guy who's sitting at the entrance, and he was the one who told you to come in again, notify him that less hilchsa kavase de Rav Yiseris, that we don't accept Rava's chumrah, stringency, with regard to a lung that has an extra lobe. The animal is kosher, it's not a treif. However, now the Gemara makes a comment about Meremar, not about him himself, but about his ruling, his leniency. Hani Mili, when can we apply Meremar's leniency in a case where we find an extra lobe? And now the Gemara is to distinguish between two locations where the extra lobe was found, two possibilities. And the kula and the hechsher of Meremar would only apply to kaima bidara diune. The extra lobe is situated in the row of lobes, meaning you could take all the lobes, which are called une, as we saw over and over again, and you can sort of line them up. one next to the other. And all of a sudden we see, hey, there's an extra lobe. Then we can say Maremar is Mekil. But even Maremar would concede Avol Beni Ubeni Trefa. So that now we find the extra lobe not in the row of the lobes, but in between two rows. And he explains here the following. Now, there's something called the ventral side of the lungs, and there's something called the dorsal side of the lungs. So the way I understand it, the ventral side of the lungs is that side of the lungs which is on the underside, meaning the belly side of the lungs. Now, we discussed in the past that the rose-like lobe, which is the main lobe, is situated on the underside, which we call the ventral, the belly side of the lungs. And that rose-like lobe is situated between the two different main lungs. He has it here in a diagram. So again, you have these two lungs, and then you have the rose-like lobe, these two, right? Now, we said that if it's Beni Ubeni, then it's treif. So one way of explaining Beni Ubeni is, as we said before, the ventral side, the belly side of the lungs. Now we have another possibility called the dorsal side, which is the back side, not the front or the belly, but rather the spine. So the extra lobe now projects from the dorsal side of the main lung. And in that case, even Maremar would concede that the animal is a treifa. Now the Gemara wants to say that this issue about Beni Ubeni actually came up in practice. Sahu Beni Ubeni Diosel Kamid of Maravashi. So they had a set of lungs that was brought in front of Rav Ashi for a psak halacha, and there was an extra lobe that was Beni Ubeni. It was between the rows, either, as we said, on the ventral side of the lungs or on the dorsal side of the lungs. And Savar Rav Ashi l'mitzvah, based on the Gemara that we just learned, that qualifies the kula of Maremar and establishes that in a Beni Ubeni situation, even Maremar agrees that the animal is treif. Therefore, Rav Ashi initially thought that he would determine that this animal was a treifa. But Amalei Rav Huna Mar Baravav. And now, what Rav Huna is going to do is like almost a scientific study of the animals. And he says the following: Kol hani cheve baraisa. Okay, we'll translate this literally, but there's a machlokas how to interpret it. Literally translated, these are rural beasts that graze in the meadows. Alternatively, he's referring to robust beasts, I guess very powerful beasts. And all of them, according to the report of Rav Huna, have an extra lobe. And not only that, Korile tabache, the butchers have a name for this extra lobe. It's so common amongst the beasts. And they call it Inunisa de Vadra. Now, Varda, even in modern Hebrew, Vered means rose. And that was the lobe that we spoke about before, called the rose-like lobe. Except we didn't realize that that's an extra lobe, which in rural beasts or very, shall we say, robust beasts is very, very common, and it's an extra lobe. Now, the word inunisa is small. It's a small lobe, and it's called rose-like because it's very rose-like in color, and it's very fragile. And apparently, in anatomy, it's called the intermediate lobe, a small lobe that sits on the underside of the right lung. So, therefore, the existence of this lobe is normal in the anatomy of an animal, and therefore it's not a treifa. You can't tell me that every animal is born treif. Now, the Gemara says that we're going to limit the location of the extra lobe if we want to say that it's Beni Ubeni and therefore it's treif. And the Gemara says, now Hani Mili. Now we have to figure out what Hani Mili means. Let's see. He says that Hani Mili is referring to, just 1 second. Oh yeah. Hani Mili is a qualification of Rav Huna. Rav Huna, if you recall, was the Amora who was Mekil with regard to the extra lobe because it's so common and it's not pathological. So what does it mean that this extra lobe is normal? Remember, we spoke about the difference between the ventral side of the lungs and the dorsal side of the lungs. And we said that the ventral side of the lungs is the belly side of the lungs. And with regard to the belly side of the lungs, otherwise known as the ventral side of the lungs, then we could say that if he finds a small lobe, an extra lobe, which the butchers called the small rose-like lobe, then the animal is kosher. Because then we assume that this is the normal condition of the animal. And we'll just read the top line and a half on Omid Bays. Avalagava. Now we're speaking about the dorsal side of the lungs. And that's the opposite, not the belly, but rather towards the spine. It's in the back. Is afilu kitarpa diasa trefa. Now the word also we know from Maseches Sukkah, it's hadassim, a hadas, which I think in English is called a myrtle. It's a very small leaf, and therefore the animal is trefa, even if that extra lung is as small as a leaf of a myrtle. Because it's on the gav, the gaba. Gaba means the back, right? All the way in the back, the dorsal side of the lung. He says here in the footnote, the side that is against the spine. And then he's medayek based on a Rambam that if it's smaller than the leaf of a myrtle, then it's not considered an extra lobe and the animal remains kosher. Okay.